Today we're going to be wrapping up our series called Blessed that we've been in for the past about 2 months, where we've been looking at this passage of scripture called the Beatitudes, where Jesus breaks down what a good life is, what a blessed life, what a full life is. And what we've seen in this series is Jesus takes these things that we think are made up in a good life and says, no. Actually, a good life is found in these other things. And I would encourage you, if you missed last week's message, to go back and watch or listen to it, because what we're going to look at today really builds off of what we talked about last week. And so if you missed last week, I would encourage you to go to our website or go to our YouTube channel so you can watch it. Or if you prefer to listen, you can subscribe to our podcast so you can listen to it on your drive into work or while you're working out at the gym or wherever you like to listen to your podcast. I would encourage you to do so, because what we're going to look at this morning really does build off what we talked about last week. Now, I'll be honest, the passage we're going to look at this morning, this last beatitude, is really difficult. It's probably going to make us a little bit uncomfortable. It's a difficult thing to kind of grasp. And honestly, if we were to vote one of the 8 Beatitudes out, we'd probably choose this one. We'd all probably say, yeah, I don't really want this one in my life. It's difficult, but it's also powerful. You see, I think if we can embrace this, if we can look past the difficulty of it, we can embrace it, I think there's some real life change that could happen, not just in our lives, but also the people around us. See, last week we looked at this idea of being a peacemaker. We looked at this idea of embracing the peace that God has brought to us and then bringing that to those around us. But we also looked at this idea that sometimes when we do that, sometimes when we bring the peace of God to those around us, we take shots. We take hits. That's Jesus' story, right? He brought us peace, and what do? We crucified him. We mocked him. We ridiculed him. And Jesus said, if they hated me first, they're going to hate you as well. The reality is, peacemakers are going to face conflict. And what we're going to see today, what we're going to see in this passage is, what should we do when we face that conflict? What should we do when we're mocked? What should we do when we're ridiculed? What should we do when we're persecuted? What should we do when we face the troubles and trials of this life for following Jesus? And we're going to get into that in just a minute, but before we do, let me just start with a story. About 12 or 13 years ago, I was going through a really tough season of life. I was at that age where you're starting to figure out what it means to live life on your own, and I was struggling. And some of what I was facing were my own faults, like I had bad grades, and so I got kicked out of school for a semester and had to figure out what that meant and what that looked like, and that was difficult. And there are other things that happened in my life at that time that weren't really my fault. It was just the difficulties and the troubles and the trials of life, and I was struggling. Life was hard. I wasn't where I thought I would be. I wasn't doing what I thought I would be doing. It was really, really hard. And around that time, I picked up this book. It was by an author named Donald Miller, and he wrote this book called A Million Miles in 1,000 Years. And in this book, what he's doing is he's comparing what it takes to write a good movie, to tell a good story, and then how we often live our lives. And he's showing there's a disconnect. We know a good movie has these things, but often we fail to live our life that way. There's a disconnect between what we know a good story is made of and what we think a good life constitutes. And he gives this fictional plot to illustrate his point. He says, imagine you go to a movie. Remember that? I haven't been to a movie in like 3 years. But imagine you go to a movie and you pay your $15 for your ticket or whatever it costs now. You get your big thing of popcorn and your drink, and then you go sit down. And the opening credits roll, and it opens with this guy who has this dream. He wants his dream car. And for this case, Donald Miller says it's a Volvo. I don't know anybody who dreams for a Volvo, so you can insert whatever dream car you have, but this guy really wants this car. And so throughout the whole movie, he's just going through the motions to save money for this car. He's cutting pennies. He's trying to save on his utility. He's not going out to eat with his friends, and he just keeps putting more money in his bank account. He's working extra hours. He's working overtime. He's getting odd jobs, and he's just saving all this money. And this goes on for like an hour and a half. Just scene after scene after scene of this guy pinching his pennies and saving his money and working harder for this car. And then the final scene of the movie comes. He has enough money. He takes it to the car dealership. He lays down his money and they hand him the keys. He goes and gets in his dream car. Tears are streaming down his face and he drives away happy. And the movie ends. The credits roll. Now, if you were in that movie theater, what are you going to do? You're probably going to walk out and demand a refund, right? Because that's a terrible movie. It's a terrible movie. But the reality is, that's how many of us live our life. And if I'm honest, when I was going through that kind of time 12, 13 years ago, that's what I wanted out of life. I wanted an easy life. I wanted a comfortable life. I thought it was maybe not a Volvo, but there are things in life that I wanted that I thought I needed this to have a good life, to have a happy life, to have a blessed life. And when I read this book and when I heard this illustration, something in me started to click. I started to see that maybe God isn't calling me to an easy life. Maybe he's calling me to a meaningful one. I started to see, actually, I think I'm trying to live a bad story, a boring story, a story that's all about this Volvo. But maybe God's invited me to something more. And just like every good story has conflict, every good story has troubles and trials that you have to go through. That's what keeps us engaged. That's what keeps us on the edge of our seats wanting more. Maybe the same was true for my life. And I started seeing these struggles I was having, not as pain to avoid, but a story to embrace. And I tell you this because I believe the same is true for you. I believe God has something incredible for you. I believe he has an incredible story to tell in and through your life, but so often we settle for what's comfortable. We want something simple. We want these things, but that doesn't lead to a good story. It doesn't lead to a meaningful story. It doesn't even really make us happy. I don't know, maybe you've bought your dream car before and then it's great for a few months, but then eventually the shine wears off and it's not so great anymore. It didn't give us what we hoped. See, God has something more for you. It won't be easy, but it will be meaningful. Until you step into that, you're always going to see the challenges you face, the struggles you face, the trials you face, the criticism you get as something to avoid. But what if those struggles are producing something of value inside you? What if the fires of life refine you? What if the conflict you're facing is telling an incredible story? You see, this passage we're about to read, if you take that attitude that conflict produces something good, that God isn't inviting you into an easy life, but a meaningful life, this passage will make a whole lot more sense. It will be a whole lot more powerful. It will make a whole lot more of an impact in your life. And so I'd encourage you to take that attitude as we explore what Jesus says in this final beatitude about having a good life. Let's wrap it up. In Matthew chapter 5, verse 11, Jesus says this: "Blessed are you when others revile you, persecute you, and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." Now, if you've been reading through the Beatitudes, maybe you're good at English or an English major, you just noticed something. There is a major shift. Now, if you're not an English major like me, I had to study to catch this. I would have not noticed it on my own. But Jesus switches here. He switches from the third person to the second person. So far, the previous 7 Beatitudes, they've said, blessed are the peacemakers. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst. Blessed are whatever, right? Blessed are the meek. Blessed are the poor in spirit. But now Jesus switches and he says, blessed are you. He switches here. Blessed are you. And this isn't a mistake. This is intentional because Jesus knows some of the people in this crowd that are listening to this sermon, that are listening to the Beatitudes, they're going to take seriously what Jesus says, and they're going to go live their life as he is telling them to live. And he knows, Jesus knows that when they do this in the coming years, some of the people in the crowd are going to be persecuted. They're going to be falsely accused. They're going to be criticized. They're going to face really dark days. And so what Jesus is doing is he's looking them right in the eye. He's saying, blessed are you. When that happens, when those dark days come, when those trials come, blessed are you when that happens. He's personalizing this message for them so that when they have those days, they have something to think back on and remember, oh yeah, now that I'm facing this, Jesus said, blessed. I am blessed when this happens. He's personalizing his message not only for his audience, but for us today. Blessed are you. Blessed are you when people revile, which means to criticize in an abusive or an angry or an insulting manner. Jesus qualifies it when he says falsely. He says falsely, not when it's based on something true. No, blessed are you when somebody says something that's not true, when they make up something about you based on misconceptions. Then he ends this verse with this interesting phrase, on my account. On my account. You see, unfortunately, there's a lot of Christians that get criticized, that take shots for dying on the wrong hills, for saying and doing some really dumb things. That's not what Jesus is saying. He's saying, blessed are you when you take shots for following me, when people criticize you for doing what I say is best. Blessed are you when people make up false things about you on my account. They did that to me and they're going to do that to you. But when that happens, blessed are you. Jesus is saying you are blessed when the hills you die on match the hills that he died on. He's saying, blessed are you when you're accused of hanging out with sinners, when you're accused of hanging out with the wrong people, when you're accused of loving the people that you shouldn't love. Blessed are you when you're accused of saying that Jesus is the only way, the only hope. Blessed are you when people push back, when they revile against you. You're blessed, but Jesus isn't done yet. You see, this last beatitude comes with another verse. A verse where he's going to take what we just looked at and build on it a little bit more. So let's look at Matthew 5, verse 12. He says, rejoice, be glad, for your reward is great in heaven. For so they persecuted the prophets who were before you. I mean, come on, Jesus, you can't be serious, right? I mean, it's one thing for you to tell us to endure. Okay, I get that. It's one thing for you to say your reward is great in heaven. Okay, I can kind of have delayed gratification, right? But you want me when I'm persecuted? You want me when people are falsely accusing me? You want me when people are making up stories about me to rejoice, to be glad? These words are interesting. The first word, rejoice, is a really interesting word. It's translated a bunch of different ways in English. But in Greek, what it was primarily used as was a greeting. Like, joy to you. Rejoice. I'm here. It's so good to see you. It was a greeting that you would often say when you saw somebody. And the next word, glad, be glad, means to rejoice in excessive joy. It means to have joy beyond what your circumstances should allow. So the question becomes, how can Jesus say that we should rejoice in the context of being lied about? In the context of being falsely accused? How can we rejoice and be glad when we're being persecuted? It's a really difficult thing to do. How can he say rejoice? Joy to you, be glad. And what we need to understand, what we can't miss, is Jesus isn't saying this in a trivial sense. He's not saying to fake it. He's not saying to grin and bear it. He's not saying that. What he's saying is, he's saying there's something in you. When you follow me, there's something in you that endures beyond what your circumstances are. There's something in you that despite how dark and how bad your life might be, you can still have hope. You can still have joy. And if anybody understood this, it was Jesus, right? I mean, it had to be Jesus. He understands this more fully than you and I ever will. This is exactly his life experience. Some people hated him. They ultimately nailed him to the cross. And he was able to say, rejoice and be glad, because I'm going to rejoice and be glad as this is happening to me. I want to look at a few other times in Jesus' life where this phrase of rejoice, be glad was used. Here's one of them. Matthew 26:49 says this, and he came up to Jesus at once and said, greetings, same word, Rabbi, and kissed him. You know who said that? It's Judas. As he was betraying Jesus for 30 pieces of silver. You told Jesus, rejoice, be glad. It is I who have come to betray you. The next chapter, Matthew 27:29, we see it again. It says this, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on his head and put a reed in his right hand, and kneeling before him, they mocked him, saying, Hail, same word, King of the Jews. See, as they were crucifying Jesus, they were saying, rejoice, King of the Jews. You see, Jesus knew what it was like to be mocked. He knew what it was like to be despised. He knew what it was like to be betrayed. He knew what it was like to be falsely accused. He knew what it was like to be persecuted. And here Jesus is. He's hanging on the cross. He's been beaten. And they're saying, rejoice, King of the Jews. Be full of joy. Be excessively joyful. And they're mocking him. But the irony is that Jesus was. He was full of joy. He was rejoicing in that moment. You see, Jesus isn't telling us to do something that he hasn't done himself. See, it's not a mistake that Jesus uses this word here as he's looking at this crowd on that day. Jesus was telling them and everyone that follows him that one day you're going to take shots because I'm going to take shots. But in those moments, we can be full of joy. Not when we look at our circumstances, but when we look at Jesus and what he's done for us. That's why it's later written in Hebrews chapter 12, this, looking to Jesus, the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy, same word, that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. How can you say that joy was set before Jesus as he was marching to the cross? It's because Jesus understood something that we often forget. You see, the good life isn't found in what's easy and what's comfortable. The good life is found in what's meaningful. And Jesus was able to look past his momentary circumstances that were dark, that were bleak, that were not easy, and rejoice because he knew on the other side of that pain, was something incredible. See, that's why we don't look at what's momentary, what's temporary. We look at what's eternal. That's when we can rejoice and be glad because Jesus has done for us what we could never do for ourselves. See, Jesus is looking at this crowd on the hillside and he's looking at us today and he's saying the exact same thing. He has the credibility to say rejoice and be glad because he's been through it. He's saying there's something on the other side. There's something better in eternity. So don't go for what's easy in this life because that's not going to give you what you want anyway. Step into what's meaningful. Yes, it will be difficult, but great is your reward in heaven. They persecuted the prophets before you. They criticized the people before you. But did they give up? No. They continued to step into the story that God had for them, and God did incredible things through them. And the same offer is true for you. So blessed are you. Blessed are you when you try to bring God's peace to those in your life and you take hits. Blessed are you when people falsely accuse you. Blessed are you when people criticize you. Blessed are you when people mock you. Because those trials and those difficulties, they're producing something of value in your life and for those around you. Great is your reward in heaven. So, what does this actually mean? How do we actually live this out? I think first we have to look at those who have run the race before us, those who have lived life for Jesus before us, and be encouraged by them and what God accomplished even in their difficult moments. Look at Jesus, who ran the race perfectly, and then we go and do the same. We endure, we persevere, because we understand that great is our reward in heaven. One day, all this will end, and we'll be in heaven. We'll see the fullness, the depth, the richness, the beauty of the story that God was telling, and on that day, great will our reward be. A few years ago, I was at this conference. And one of the last days, this pastor, Andy Stanley, was interviewing his father, Charles Stanley. And he was just asking about his life, about his ministry. He was asking him what it meant to follow Jesus. And Charles Stanley kept giving the same answer. Like every question. It was like 15 questions in a row, the same answer. And I started getting like a little annoyed. Like, all right, dude, maybe you're a little too old. Like, come up with some better answers here. Like, you've been following Jesus for like a long, long time. Give me some wisdom. But after he kept saying the same thing over and over again, I started seeing the wisdom in it, the beauty in it, that this really was the main thing. And he kept saying this. He kept saying, follow God and leave the consequences to him. Every question he was asked about life, about ministry, about following Jesus, about raising kids, everything, he just said, follow God. Do what God says. Follow God and leave the consequences to him. I think that's a good way to look at this. I think that's a good way to understand this passage. We're not called to worry about the consequences. We're not called to worry about the outcome. We're just called to follow God. He'll deal with everything else. He'll work everything else for his benefit, for his glory and our benefit. He'll do that. We're just called to follow him. Leave the consequences up to him. He'll worry about the difficult part. He'll do the heavy lifting. We're just called to follow him. So follow God and leave the consequences to him. Paul says it this way in 2 Corinthians 13. He says, finally, brothers, rejoice. Aim for restoration, comfort one another, agree with one another, live in peace, and the God of love and peace will be with you. See, this theme of rejoice is all over the Bible. And I could read verse after verse after verse that tells us to rejoice. I mean, Jesus stresses it. Paul keeps bringing it up. You see, part of following Jesus, why they keep doing this, part of following Jesus is going to be difficult. There's going to be challenging days. There's going to be dark days. And so what happens all throughout the Bible is it reminds us to rejoice because our reward is great in heaven. And we need to look past the difficult and dark circumstances that we might face and recognize that this is producing something of value in us. Great will our reward be if we endure, if we keep following God, if we keep following God and leaving the consequences to him. We can rejoice not based in our circumstances, but based in who Jesus is and what he's done for us. See, Jesus knows. He knows that the people listening that day, and he knows that us today, we're going to have a temptation. That when the challenges come, when the trials come, when the criticism starts rolling in, when people start mocking us, he knows the temptation is going to be for us to just withdraw. To create our own Christian subculture, to go to our own schools, listen to our own music, engage with our own TV shows, and just withdraw from the world and let them fend for themselves. He knows that's going to be our temptation. And so he's trying to remind us, that's not what I've called you to do. I haven't called you to an easy life. I haven't called you to a comfortable life. I've called you to a meaningful life. I've invited you into an incredible story, and there's going to be conflict. There's going to be tough days, but you can't withdraw. The world needs my love and my hope, and I'm sending you into the world. That's our marching orders, is to go to the lost and the hurting and the broken and to bring the love and the hope and the joy and the peace that God has given to us and given to them. It's not going to be easy, but it will be worth it. It will be meaningful. We cannot withdraw. Eternity hangs in the balance. So embrace the story that God has for you. Embrace what he has for you. That's my encouragement for you this morning and this week. is to shift your focus. To understand that God's not inviting you something easy, he's inviting you into something meaningful. Embrace it. Embrace it, because if you do, the impact will go on long after you're gone. And great will your reward be in heaven. So don't settle. Don't go for what's easy. Don't go for what's comfortable. Go for what's meaningful. Step into the story that God has for you. And in all things, rejoice with excessive joy beyond what your circumstances should allow, because you have what cannot be taken from you. You have Jesus. So rejoice. Be glad, for great is your reward in heaven.